Hi, Jules.
Sorry I'm late.
It's okay. We happen to be talking about time today, so it'll fit right into our discussion. Okay, let's pray. We thank you, Lord, for the privilege of beginning a new week. We pray that you would give us minds and hearts to learn, to grow, to be transformed into the image of the Lord Jesus by the Spirit of God, using natural and temporal things in order to accomplish an eternal objective. And we don't fully understand how that all fits together, but we believe it because you've told us so, and we trust you. We ask for your blessing in Jesus' name, amen. Okay, we ended up on this slide last time, I think, or right around here. Just remember, all of you guys are functioning, by and large, on a sequential time. 8 o'clock is class, 9 o'clock dorm vivos. And so that's the way we think. And the thing is, most of us who grew up with that kind of a time orientation don't even give it another thought. I never considered the fact that there may be another way of viewing time. But a synchronous time or polychronic time takes several times schedules and allows them all to blend together in order to come up with something more like this, allowing for overlap. And this is really overly simplistic. In addition to overlap, there might even be switching around of certain things. In other words, the order isn't even necessarily that important. If somebody comes along who's very important in my life, I may shove everything else aside and entertain that person. So people tend to be more important here, and accomplishments tend to be more important up here. Okay? So that's kind of where we left off. So what's interesting in this whole discussion is, what do you do with the word interruption? I don't think I have this on your notes. What's the last blank that we filled in? Okay. Okay. Polychronic?
Monochronic.
Okay.
It's like right under monochronic versus polychronic and a dash sequential approach to time.
Okay. All right. Well, I have a monochronic linear approach to time. What did I, sequential? That's okay. Sequential is a fine word. Linear is probably the more broad term, so probably prefer to use that. All right, let me fill these in real quick before I talk about interruptions. I'll interrupt myself. Number one, planning and management are important. These are all no-brainers. Everything I'm going to say here is something you take for granted. Planning and management are important. One task should be done at a time. Have you ever heard somebody say, don't start something else until you finish the first one? That sounds really good in a textbook, but in real life, that's almost impossible to maintain. 3, work tasks and personal tasks are kept separate. So, if you punch into work, how many of you punch into work right now someplace? Okay, you punch into work, you have to be very careful about not using personal time on the clock. Okay, it's an ethical issue, it's a question of honesty. And I'm not saying that that doesn't happen in the 2/3 majority world. I'm just saying that it's more common for that. Now, I'm salaried, and so, but I still have an ethical responsibility to make sure I'm putting in my time to prepare and all of that, but it's not the same as a time clock situation. So really, a salaried position almost reflects a little bit more, the polychronic mindset, because you can mix different things in. I'm working, and someone comes to visit me, it has nothing to do with work, but it's important, I'll go home and spend time with them as long as I get my work done. That actually reflects more of a polychronic mindset. Number 4, punctuality is important, is an important measure of good stewardship. And I want to talk a little bit more about punctuality in just a little bit. It's an important measure of good stewardship. 5, the focus is more individualistic, which you would expect, right? And it is a task-driven orientation. That's what I said earlier. The linear approach focuses more on tasks, a to-do list, okay, whereas the bottom one more on people. All right, I'm going to pause there for a minute. Interruptions. When you hear the word interruptions, what strikes you? What kind of an impulse does that give you? Interruption. What's your knee-jerk reaction to the word interruption? Jules?
Taking up someone's time or like getting in the way of someone else's conversation.
Okay, so if you're talking about interrupting a conversation, you're taking someone's time or maybe stealing somebody's time almost, right? Right, good. What else comes to mind when you think of interruption? Yeah, Paul?
Being distracted from doing what you're supposed to be doing.
Okay, distraction from what you're supposed to be doing. How many times do you hear people say, focus, focus, they're focus, focus. And so interruption, is contradictory to the whole concept of focusing. What else? Interruption. Yeah.
Something unexpected.
Okay, a lot of times they're unexpected. Yeah, and a lot of times we in the West even almost live in fear of them. We approach a list of things to do in the back of our mind. What if something happens? What if? Sometimes we actually live, almost in fear that some interruption may come along the way that destroys the continuity of my day. Anything else? Interruption. Was that a hand?
We would say inconvenience.
Inconvenience. That's a good word. How many of you actually schedule an interruption in your day? In some ways, we sometimes do that. If you say, I'm going to give myself 2-hour block, to accomplish something, and it only should take an hour, there's a certain sense in which you are planning for interruptions. And people will tell you to do that when you're scheduling your day. Don't make it so squeaky tight that, any little misstep, throws the whole thing off kilter. Okay? Yeah, it's almost impossible for us to say the word interruption and think of it positively. It's always a negative thing. See, but the fact is, in a polychronic culture, interruption isn't even a word that is used commonly, because interruptions are built in to a polychronic way of going about life. In other words, if I'm doing something and somebody comes and says, hey, can I talk to you? My mind doesn't say interruption. My mind says, oh, there's a person that needs help. And it's a very, very different mindset. And frankly, I wish that I had a little bit more of that. Because when I get going on something, and some of you are that way too, Some of us are task masters, even of ourselves. And we punish ourselves if we get off task. So, again, I'm not saying one's right or one's wrong, but interruptions are very different from our standpoint. What do you think of this? Let's see, you got red, pink, yellow, and purple. Sorry. Red, pink, yellow, and green. 4 different times going on there. Now, you look at that, and what comes to your mind? Confusion, disorganization. You see, this looks clean and organized. But that's our concept. Somebody from a polychronic world may look at this and say, this is the way it should be. We allow for all kinds of things to be happening, This here is straight-laced, it's narrow, it ignores the needs of people, it ignores things that may come up. It's far too strict. Right? Here's another way. Did you know that every single culture in the world believes in punctuality? Every culture. No matter where you go in the world, there is a certain window of punctuality. The question is, what is that window? In our culture, on time means this. Jules, you walked in at 8:02 and said, sorry, I'm late. Okay? Now, in some cultures, I would say, you wouldn't even think of that. You'd walk in at 8:05 and nobody would say anything because there's that window. Now, having said that, let me just say this. Even in polychronic cultures, certain things are red or blue punctual. At our seminary, I may have said this, in our seminary in Brazil, we had an alarm system, not alarm, a bell system, electronic bell system. And at 8 o'clock, it went off. And if the students came in after the bell, they were to be marked tardy. Is that because Brazil is a monochronic culture? No, but there are monochronic elements that exist even in polychronic cultures. Does that make sense? The bus system in Brazil that travels inner cities, not the one that's in town, but the one that goes from out of town, state to state, city to city. One time I showed up 2 minutes late and I missed the bus, and the only reason the bus stopped is because somebody who worked in the bus system was with me, and they went out and sent somebody to stop the bus. But then I got scolded by the driver when I got on. It wasn't my fault. Somebody was showing me around who was very polychronic, and he forgot or ignored the fact that the bus system happens to be monochronic. and so I got chewed out by the driver, but I just ignored it and sat down. It was a 13-hour bus drive, and it only went every day or two. So if I had missed that one, you know. So understand that even in a polychronic culture, there are certain things that are monochronic, and vice versa. Okay, can you give me an example of something in our culture, even though we're very monochronic? Can you think of some aspect of our culture that's more polychronic in its orientation? Yeah.
Midwestern goodbyes.
Is that a Midwest thing? Yeah.
I guess so, because some people, like, I've heard on the, I don't know what kind of side, south side, but they are more like, okay, we're done, goodbye, and then we're just like, oh, goodbye, and that's it, like 3 times.
Yeah. Our backyard is on 18th Street. It's a cul-de-sac. And we say goodbye several times to our kids when they leave, and then when they go, they have to go down 18th to go home, and we're out there on the deck waving goodbye to them when they go. Yeah. Yeah. Emma?
I don't know if they have these, they probably do, but like an open house, like we say, you can come when you want, and I know that's kind of not the same, but that's one of the things.
Okay, but it does reflect the idea. Open house at 2 o'clock. But if you come at 3, it's, we usually say 2 to 4. Yeah, yeah. In that case, part of the reason is because you don't have a specific program. In fact, you probably don't want everybody showing up at the same time because you have a big long line, and yeah. And so where there's not a specific schedule, but just a window of time, you can do that in our culture. Yep. Good. Sometimes it's when something is not super important, like our church, some of our people are going to do Super Bowl parties next Sunday. And so, you hear them say, just come whenever you want. Some people don't care about the game. They just want the fellowship, and they'll show up, halftime, or they don't care. They're not even paying attention to the game. So, but that happens. Just to be aware that does happen. Okay. Before I get to this, let's go on to polychronic down at the bottom or wherever it is on your page. Work lives and personal lives are more intertwined, is the word there. Intertwined. Now that doesn't mean that somebody in Brazil can go to work and just, understand that. But it's not as pronounced as it is here. 2, multiple responsibilities can be fulfilled simultaneously or at the same time, whatever you want to put in there. So multitasking fits in very well in a polychronic culture. And you guys, your generation is more of a multitasking generation than mine was. And some of that is gender-oriented. Ladies, correct me if I'm wrong, and men too, for that matter. It just seems to me that ladies have a greater capacity to be doing something around the house and still paying attention to the movie or the game than men can. I don't know. If I'm watching a game, I got to watch the game. My wife can be ironing or doing dishes or doing something else and still be watching. Maybe that's because she doesn't care as much about the details of the game. I like to watch everything. But anyway, you can multitask. 3, the daily routine appears disorganized. It appears disorganized. That doesn't mean it is. And that's where you got to be careful. You don't accuse somebody of being sloppy. You know, it's not, it can be, but not necessarily. Number 4, responding to people trumps efficiency. And this is where I got in trouble more than once in Brazil. Just greater loyalty to the clock than to people. Number 5, module classes are hard to dedicate as the only priority for the week. Module classes. That's just an example of that. Of people want to multitask. I won't ask you for any confessions, but how many of you have ever been tempted to watch a video for a module while you're doing something else at the same time? Now I know that there are some people that actually can't pay attention as well if they're just sitting and staring at the screen. I actually talked to a parent one time who had a student in my class, and she told me this. She says, if my child is sitting like this and watching you as you teach, he's far away. But if he's doodling and doing something like that, he's paying attention. He's tracking with you. So some of it has to do even with personality traits and things like that that can make a difference. But as a principle, all right, number 6, the most extreme examples are in Aboriginal. Where's that? What's Aboriginal? Yeah, Australia, New Zealand. It's kind of the outback. And Latin American cultures. Those are where you have the most extreme cases of polychronic cultures. Aboriginal and Latin American cultures. Number 7, France is more polychronic and annoys Germans and Americans. Now, if Miriam were here, she could testify to that. And I don't know enough of French history to develop that idea. Okay. Number 8, nonprofit groups seem to be more polychronic. Nonprofit organization. Why? Because most nonprofit organizations exist for what purpose? Yeah, they're helping people. And so the government actually gives them a break because they're doing a service to the community, right, in some way. And because they're helping people, then in general, they're not as, punctual oriented as other groups are. Okay? All right. Let me see. Okay. Short-term, number 5 is short-term versus long-term orientation. Short-term versus long-term orientation. So, just a little exercise here. You know which 3 countries these are? By the way, did you guys hear about the big balloon that passed over the United States? Yeah, very interesting. They shot it down finally, but probably only because people started taking pictures and videos of it and the government had to do something. But anyway, that's another. So we have United States. So which one of those 3 would you say is more past oriented? In other words, when it comes to the way they do time, they base their actions more on the richness of their past. Yeah, exactly. China is one of the oldest countries in the world, and in general, this is not necessarily always the case, but in general, the older the culture, the more emphasis they give to their history, their heritage, when it comes to how they plan their schedules. And so when China is also a very proud country, and partly because of the wealth of time in their history. Very, very old. Which one would you say is more present-oriented, France or the United States? And then think of which one would be more future-oriented. Pardon? Yeah. It's a more, when it comes to its age, It's not as old as China, but it's older than the United States. The United States has a reputation for constantly forward thinking. Okay? We're the young nation. The United States grew quickly, and part of the reason it grew quickly was always thinking ahead. How can we get to here? How can we get to here? Older nations aren't thinking about that as much. Okay, now, obviously there are factors that change that, okay, but the United States has been more of a future-oriented nation. So, back to your notes, short-term versus long. With the United States, when it comes to making plans, would the United States tend to be short-term or long-term oriented? Does it tend to make plans that we need to fulfill sooner than later or later than sooner? Yeah.
Sooner than
Short term. When a president is elected, how many days does he have to prove that he's going to be worth his salt? What does every president have to face when he's elected? 100 days plan. That's become a standard. Every president is supposed to establish, this is what I'm going to do in the first 100 days in office. And if he hasn't done something significant in the first, that's 3 months, then a lot of people just write him off. He's no good. He's been in office 3 months, he hasn't done anything yet. That's short term, super short term, okay? And so, and that's because, and part of that is the Industrial Revolution, where time is money and, progress is everything. Okay, so letter A, the U.S. has little patience for long-term cultures. We want to get someplace. We want progress. Letter A. Letter B, Confucian cultures. Confucian, as in Confucius, right? The Chinese philosopher. Confucian cultures are very long-term. The value, it should be they, if it's not correct. They value perseverance, thrift, and high national reserves. Now, you could argue the U.S. values its national reserves, but then you have to consider how many $1 trillion debt we have. But nowadays, because of globalization, virtually every major country in the world is suffering from the same disease. All right. Letter C, short-term cultures look at the recent past and see the near future. Okay, a small window of time. The president preceding me messed up, so I have to act quickly to undo what he did. Rather than looking back at hundreds of years of history and saying, what is the general tendency of things? If you stop and think about it, even the American people, when a president is elected, he's compared with his predecessor. Well, they may talk a little bit about other presidents that were previous, but usually it's what is Clinton going to do to undo what Trump did, or whatever. All right? Very short term in the way we view things. And by the way, this is one of the things I would just encourage you guys when it comes to this. We tend to make what's the best word to use here? I think sometimes we jump to conclusions about the Church of Jesus Christ, even in this sense. We see recent developments in American history or the American church, and we tend to make, prophetic. I remember when I was in high school, people, seeing something happen in Washington and saying, well, no doubt the rapture is going to be soon. I heard people say, I doubt we'll be here next year at this time because of something that happened in Washington yesterday. That is a product of this same kind of thinking. Very short term. Recent consequences, we got to do something quick. And instead of looking at the bigger picture. And I just want to encourage you guys to do that. Yeah, there are things that are happening in the church, recent things, but just be careful that you don't draw general conclusions based on limited data. Okay. D, short-term cultures are quicker to spend money. Why do Americans get in such credit card debt? Because they're pushed, encouraged to be short-term in their thinking. Now, having said that, my wife and I went out on Saturday and bought a new oven because our other one went belly up. But we did have money in savings, praise the Lord for that. But, you know, sometimes short-term decisions have to be made. All right. Letter E, most donors come from short-term cultures and stop giving when things don't happen quickly. Let me see if I even... Okay. Number 2, the two-thirds world and the West. A, the two-thirds world tends to be more event-oriented. We've already been there, more event than time. B, the West tends to be more time-oriented. We've already talked about that. And letter C, the gap between the two appears to be gradually closing. The impact of globalization does bring nations closer together in some ways. People have been asking, you know, will there ever become one world culture? And I think the answer is no. You know, the gap may be closing, but you're never going to have, in this present existence, a one world culture. There are just too many things that have to change that aren't going to, you know. Now, what will happen in the millennium? I believe that even in the millennium, there will be varieties of cultures and that Christ will reign over those. All right. Agricultural versus industrialized nations. Just one second. Let me check something here in my notes. I want to see. Okay. All right. Let me... before I get to the agricultural, let me just give you this. This is not in your notes. In a polychronic culture, it's okay and even expected to be late. In fact, in some cultures, if you show up on time, it's an offense. Because in some cases, people aren't expecting you that soon, and if you show up too soon, you know, things aren't ready. In our culture, if you invite somebody over for dinner at 6 o'clock, you better have everything ready. But in some cultures, you invite them over at 6, you don't expect them to come till 6:30. And if you come punctually, you could actually cause a rift. And then it takes longer to get down to business. Now, for instance, if two people who are doing a business deal get together, or let's say a ministry, two leaders are getting together to talk about a potential ministry. In the West, when they get together and sit down, you know, they may say a few words of greeting, how's your family and all that, then they'll pretty much get right down to business, okay? Whereas in a polyculture, you may spend a significant amount of time talking about other things. The Western mind might consider those things peripheral, they're time wasters. But in the polychronic time, it's a part of the bonding process. We don't get down to business on something until we've had time to cultivate our relationship, talk about family, talk about life in general, talk about, you know, whatever. Then you eventually kind of morph into your discussion about whatever business you're getting into. All right? Okay, here we go. The Industrial Revolution, okay? So you see the agricultural on top, the industrial on the bottom. Agricultural is the first one, letter A. In an agricultural community, time is more, now think of farmers. What word would you use to fill that in there? If you're a farmer, time is what? When you think of the way things work, planting, reaping, time is related to what? Seasons. Time is more seasonal. Yep. In other words, in an agricultural culture, people recognize that they don't have control of the time. That makes sense? They have to flow with nature or, you know, with God, depending on how you view it. One of the reasons that the Western culture becomes so godless is because once you take control of time, you don't need God anymore. See, You have lights, so you can do things at night. You can literally do just about anything 24/7 in an industrial society because you have the technology to do it. And that facilitates the attitude that I don't need God. We can do it all ourselves. Whereas in an agricultural country, you realize that there's something or someone else that's controlling the time. Interesting. 2, time is elastic. Elastic. Now, here at Faith, if you go to a professor and say, "Could I have a couple more days on this assignment?" A lot of times the professor will say, "Yeah, that's fine." Now, if you start doing it every day, but even here, we try to exercise a little bit of elasticity. Strict time frames may be viewed as dysfunctional. It's all theory. Bang, 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 but we don't live in a theoretic world. We live in a real world. We're going to plant 1st of April. 1st of April, there's snow on the ground's still frozen. What do? You wait. Okay? Industry. Okay? In industry, the assembly line made time an asset. Again, that's just review. We talked about that. Time became equivalent to money, and punctuality became a standard for rewards and punishment. You're late, you get docked, right? You lose some pay, or you get warned. PDI, what is it, 7 minutes before or after you can come in? Who's the PDI guys here? Is it 7 minutes you have either side of the clock?
15.
Is it 15? You can come in 15 minutes, okay. All right. And then 4, the wristwatch became the most popular graduation gift. Because since time is so important and time is money, I want to have time on me at all times. Can you imagine living in a culture where you didn't have access to time all the time? Before the wristwatch was invented, if you weren't around a wall clock somewhere, how would you know what time it is? We take that for granted. All you got to do is pull your phone out and you can see what time it is. Or you're tapping on your wall. So people started buying wristwatch for graduation gifts. Cool. All right. Let's see. Okay, time in the Bible. Number 4, time in the Bible. There are 2 Greek words, so we'll have a little Greek lesson today. And you guys, chronos should sound familiar, right? We get our word chronology. Chronos refers to the sequence. It's that linear time, all right? Whereas kairos, it's translated time, but it really means more the idea of an opportunity, okay? The reason it's translated time is because opportunities come at certain times. But kairos emphasizes the opportunity more than the actual time on the clock. So let's look at a few Bible passages real quick. This is not in your notes. Well, yes, I did put some in your notes. Here's kairos. More of the opportunity. Be careful how to live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity. Now the King James says redeeming the time. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that word, but opportunity is probably a little bit more exact translation. Same thing in Colossians 4, making most of every opportunity, redeeming the time. How about chronos, sequence? But when the fullness of time had come, very clearly linear, God is working in history, and when the specific point in time arrived, God has sent his son. God punctually sent his son. That's a linear idea. So it would be wrong to say that there are certain cultures or eras of time when you don't have one or the other. Every culture has some recognition of linear and polychronic time. The question is more of which one rules the day. Okay? Here's a verse that has 2 together. When the disciples asked, is this the time you're going to renew the kingdom, restore the kingdom? He says, it's not for you to know the chronos, the sequence of God's time, his plan in history, or the seasons that the Father has fixed. Interesting that he uses both of those designations. Sorry, I forgot the other parenthesis there, but, well, you know something? I don't fix it now, probably never will. There we go. Okay. So there's a case where both words are used. John 9. Now, John doesn't use the word here, but the concept is here. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming and no one can work. Is that more of a chronos or a kairos approach? Which one? Kairos, right, the opportunity. He's talking about taking advantage of the opportunity. Proverbs 27, do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring forth. What does that reflect more? Chronos or kairos? Horrible question for 8:30 in the morning. It's more chronos, tomorrow. You're thinking ahead, one day, the next day. Don't boast about tomorrow. That's more of a chronological view. Psalm 90, teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Chronos or kairos? Yeah, I think it's more kairos. Yep. Numbering our days. Take the idea of taking advantage. Numbering isn't necessarily 1, 2, 3, 4, but the idea of remembering that we only have a certain window of opportunity and we need to take advantage. Do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. Chronos or kairos? I think he's thinking more of chronos there. We think of day after day, and with God, one day is like 1,000 years. So it's the way we measure the duration of a day, or the concept of a day. So, time's up. We have to move on to the next one. Not time up in class, time up in this subject. All right, well, like I said, this time one is probably one of the ones that you will most battle if God takes you to a culture that's different in its time orientation. So just be prepared for that. All right, well, let's at least jump into the next one, which is communication, okay, direct. Oh, I'm sorry, did I have an extra couple things in the notes down there? Yeah, let me give those to you. Sorry about that. The little exercise there is just something for you to think about. We're not actually going to do it in class. Just kind of, where do you put yourself when it comes to, how punctually oriented you are as opposed to being more relaxed? Can I just ask you this? Is there anybody here that would put himself or herself on the right side of this, more people-oriented than time-oriented in general? You tend to be, okay, yeah. And again, remember we said at the very beginning of this course, a lot of this is related to personality. It's not all a question of culture. Within cultures, personality can influence. All right, so what is the difference between the blue side and the red side of this? It's not Democratic and Republican, okay? What's being illustrated here? Yeah.
Being like straightforward and like kind of going around in like a circle and
Yeah.
putting more details.
Okay, exactly. Which one are you most comfortable with when you're communicating with somebody? You like this approach, or do you prefer this one? If the dean calls you into the office, you want this or do you want this? What do you want? Oh, you want this one? Why?
Because I want to know why I'm there.
Yep.
I have to be around bush.
Sooner I find out why I was dragged in here, the better. Okay? Is there anybody that says, I'd rather the dean sit down and do some sweet talking first before we actually get to the, yeah. It kind of depends sometimes on what the conversation is about. But in general, in the West, we're more this way. Okay. So it's direct, low context, indirect, high context. All right. Oh, I never gave you those last two, did I? Sorry about that. All right, let me go back and do that. Two closing thoughts on that page. Time-oriented people should strive to build in time flexibility. My apologies. Flexibility. And B, event-oriented people should seek to understand the consequences of missed deadlines. So whichever culture you're in, if you have come from the other kind, these are things that you should at least keep in mind. There are lots of things, but these are two big ones. All right? I had a problem with flexibility, just had trouble doing that. Okay, here we go. Communication. Number one, this is not in your notes, but again, somebody's research came up with this, that low contact in Germany is at least way off on the left side. Germans like to get to the point in general, okay? Chinese cultures, African, Arab, Greek, Latin American in general, in some parts of Europe, are much more, they want to work their way in. Okay, now there's specific reasons why this happens, and we might get to some of that today. The English, we tend to be more, give it to me straight up. But again, this is just somebody's research, not necessarily. All right, so, hold on. Okay, before we get to this, number one, another way of saying it is low context versus high context communication. What do we mean? If I say that somebody practices low context communication, what am I saying? Jules?
You get, you don't get the background, you go just read.
Okay, yeah. Low context means there's not as much background or surrounding information, context, which means I'm going to be. What's that going to do? How's that going to affect the way that I communicate?
It either makes it straight to the point, but it can make it confusing.
Yeah, it drives me to be more specific, the more straight up approach, right? Because I don't have context to depend on, right? Whereas if you have a high context within the relationship, you can say things very nebulously and the person gets the point. Because so I walk home, I walk in the door, and after a hard day, my wife says, "How you doing, honey?" And I say, "Fine." And I walk away. Now, I use a very straight up, fine, but because of the high context of my marriage relationship, my wife knows that my day wasn't fine, okay? So all I had to say was one word, but the way I said it in the context communicated everything, okay? So, and of course, the highest context of any relationship in general in the world is what? What's the highest context relationship? Where are you going to find the highest context when you're communicating? Family. Husband, wife, kids, right. There are exceptions, but in general, that's the case. All right, a few examples. High context or indirect communication. Liberia and Japan are two very high context countries. I would assume that the Democratic Republic of Congo is also very high context in general.
Specific?
Less specific, high context. Yeah, and I realize that it's going to vary somewhat. But low context or direct, the U.S. and the Netherlands. If you don't just spit it out, then people might wonder if I'm trying to pull the wool over their eyes or I'm just being a coward or whatever. Okay, so now let's compare the two. Number three, comparing the characteristics of each context. Low context, so we'll start with that one here. Communication is explicit and direct. That's letter A there, which is kind of what I'm doing in the notes. Although, have you noticed that sometimes I get away from the notes and I kind of wander from them and I'm a little more high context. That actually is an example of high context. Because of what we've already talked about, I can go off on a rabbit trail. I can show you verses that aren't in the notes and things. But because of the context that we've built in our discussion, you have the ability to move along with me in that. Other times we're glued to the notes, A, B, C, D, okay? It's amazing how much this happens. Okay, now what I'm doing here is I'm going down to letter C, okay? Because I'm giving you all the ones on this side first. So just skip down to letter C, that next bracket there, where it says low context, the meeting place is based more on convenience. Appearance is of little importance. And that's an objective approach. Let me ask you this to illustrate. You guys walked into this classroom at 8 o'clock or 8:02, Jules? Just kidding. I'm just teasing you. How much did the appearance of the room impact what we're doing in here? Not a whole lot. The color, the carpeting, the windows. I mean, we have Nettleton 104 that doesn't even have any windows, right? Some of you have classes over there. Now, you know, there are certain things that we use in here, but the general layout of the classroom is really more utilitarian. As long as we have the basics that we need, a place to sit and write, doesn't matter what kind of desks they are, or even the order. We could put them in a circle, or we can leave them like they are here. Doesn't really matter. That's a utilitarian approach, which is connected to the more low context culture. Now, give me an example in our culture where the ambiance of a place is extremely important. The way it's arranged and decorated and all that. When does that become really important? A wedding. Probably the first thing that comes to a lot of our minds is a wedding. Everything, it's a church, and you want it to be a church, because we do, because we understand the role God putting people together. But why? Because when people walk in, you want them to blend into the context of a wedding ceremony. And that is extremely important. What about a birthday party? We just had a birthday party for our 1-year-old granddaughter. By the way, we're babysitting our 2 little ones that are the 2 little girls of David and Marissa. One's 1 and one's 3. But we had the birthday party for Haley. I almost said Hadley. We have a Harper and a Haley. So the theme, she made a theme, and the theme was bubbles. So she bought these, they're like balloons, but they're like, look like bubbles, and had them all over the place. You walk in and immediately you're struck with that. And so there are times, even in a low context culture, where high context is very. What about a sporting event? You go to a ball game, and the way that the risers, the bleachers are arranged, everything, the smell of popcorn when you come in. Every time I smell popcorn, I think of an athletic event, because most of them have it. All those things. So even in a low context culture, there are certain things that are very high context. All right? Okay, it is time to go. Just write this one in. Letter E, this is letter E down here. There is misunderstanding. When there is misunderstanding, the communicator has failed, and that is explicit. Meanings are important. Explicit. So if you guys don't get the material in this class, in a low context culture, it's my fault. I did. You ever hear the statement, if the student hasn't learned, the teacher hasn't taught? That is a low context way of looking at teaching. And we'll talk more about that next time. All right, thanks.